Someone said my office wasn't real, so I've dressed it up a bit. Let me apologise right from the start of this video because it might turn into a bit of a rant. The thing is, I feel quite strongly about something which might be just a misunderstanding, or it could be a bit of a con. Let me explain. I've just checked around the office and I reckon there are 9 cameras in here, all with different sensor sizes. And that's not unusual. In fact, it's brilliant. It's great for us to have the choice to choose the most appropriate sensor for whatever shoot we're going to do. What is surprising me is how many professional camera people I've met who don't seem to understand the relationship between sensor size and the actual quality of the pictures they're going to get. Some of them like to call themselves DOPs. Now, I know I'm going off on one, but what really started me thinking about this was actually when I bought a new drone, the Mavic 2 Pro, with a Hasselblad camera. It's got a reassuringly large sensor, but what started me thinking was all to do with the writing on the front. f2.8 at the equivalent of 28mm. Sounds good. In fact, it sounds totally unbelievable. I know what they mean. They mean the equivalent of 28mm if it was on a full frame or a 35mm size sensor. The thing is, I know the difference between aperture diameter and the size of the entrance pupil, which is how big it looks when you look through the front. But even so, 28mm at f2.8 would give you an aperture diameter of about 10mm. And that's almost bigger than this camera. Clearly, we're not being told the full story. Actually, this camera has a lens of a focal length of about 10mm. And the 1-inch sensor, it's not 1 inch in size. That comes from the old tube days when tubes were round. And anyway, a 1-inch sensor is actually about 12.8mm wide. So this has a crop factor of about 2.8. That gives you the equivalent of 28mm on a full frame camera, but not at f2.8. It would be more like f8. And f8 doesn't sound nearly as good, does it? Let me explain why. Here's a shot I took earlier on my full frame Canon at 50mm focal length and f5.6. And here's the same shot using a 25mm lens, also at 5.6, but it's on my GH5. Now it's 25mm because the GH5 has a micro 4/3 sensor, and that's a crop factor of 2. Just makes our sums easier. Although 25mm on the smaller sensor might be equivalent to 50mm on the full frame, they don't actually look the same, do they? The background is more out of focus on the full frame. It has a shallower depth of field. You can see it on the blinds. You can see the width of the blinds and how out of focus the telescope is. The background is much sharper on the micro 4/3 or the smaller sensor. These do not look the same. So a 25mm lens on a GH5 isn't really equivalent to a 50mm lens on a full frame. They look quite different. The only thing that is the same is the field of view, nothing else. Now I know some people will say, well, that's obvious. A larger sensor will give you a shallower depth of field. And I wish I had £1 for every time somebody said that to me. But brace yourselves, it's just not true. Different size sensors don't actually change the depth of field. They just change the amount you're cropping the picture. So the depth of field isn't changed directly. The depth of field in this case has changed because we've changed the physical size of the aperture. They're both at f5.6, but f5.6 is a fraction. It's the focal length divided by 5.6, and we've changed our focal length. The full frame lens is 50mm divided by 5.6, which gives an aperture diameter of almost 9mm wide. Now on every lens, there's only actually one point that's really in focus. Everything else is out of focus, but it might be acceptably sharp. In other words, if you can't see it's out of focus, does it matter? So on my grossly oversimplified drawing, you can take one point on our subject, a tree in this case, yeah, it's a tree, and look at the angle that the light is coming from that point into the lens. You can think of it as a cone, and the height of that cone is really important to whether something looks in focus or not. And when you reach that height, that's the limit of your depth of field, because anything bigger looks out of focus. Now the 25mm lens is still at 5.6, but that actually means the aperture diameter is only 4.5mm wide. So the light from our tree has to squeeze through a smaller hole, which makes the angle smaller and our cone longer before it reaches that critical height. And if we've got a longer cone, we've got more depth of field. This is way oversimplified, and there are other factors involved, but it does demonstrate the issue. If you disagree with this, that's fine. Let me know in the comments below. Maybe we should do another video all about focal length, depth of field, circular confusion, pixel density. Just let me know. The f-stop number is just the focal length divided by the diameter of the aperture. You can't divide one half of this sum and ignore the other half. It won't add up. If you're going to divide the focal length by a crop factor, in this case 2, you've also got to divide the aperture by the same crop factor. So here's our same shot again on the full frame camera at 50mm and f5.6. And here it is again on the Micro Four Thirds sensor, which has a 2x crop. So now we're at 25mm focal length, but it's f2.8. So we've applied our crop factor to both the focal length and the f-stop. And now I think you'll agree we're much closer. These pictures look almost the same. So applying the same maths to this little Hasselblad camera, it isn't really equivalent to a 28mm lens on a full frame sensor at f2.8. It's more like a 28mm lens on a full frame sensor at f8. So now you're probably thinking, I knew all this, what's the problem? Well, I wouldn't like to say that camera and lens manufacturers are intentionally misleading people just to make their lenses sound better, are they? Look at this page from the Panasonic UK website. The Lumix 12 to 35mm f2.8, a Micro Four Thirds standard zoom lens, 24 to 70, 35mm camera equivalent. Get high f2.8 brightness over the entire zoom range with this high-speed zoom lens. Its focal length of 12 to 35mm, 35mm camera equivalent 24 to 70, covers a wide angle. And here's the sales description of a Sony lens. Its f1.8 aperture makes it the brightest telephoto lens in its class, and with 35mm equivalent 202.5mm focal length. And finally, this great one from Canon. The large f2.8 aperture provides excellent results in low light conditions. The aperture remains constant throughout the full focal length range, allowing you to zoom from approximately 27 to 88mm, 35mm equivalent, without slowing shutter speed. Do you think that Canon lens would sound quite so attractive if it was correctly described as the equivalent of a 27 to 88mm f4.5? But that's what it really means in picture quality. It doesn't sound so good, does it? And it's not just people selling lenses who are having difficulty with this.
And this is equivalent to a 24 to 70mm lens.
It's sharp even at f2.5, and it gives you a 28mm equivalent focal length, which is nice and wide.
But had the f2.8 go at least to 25, that gives you about a 50mm equivalent.
For the equivalent of a 70 to 200 f2.8 on full frame, it is very small and light. its full frame equivalent would be maybe 3 or 4 times that.
The crop factor is 2. So basically you're actually shooting with a 24 to 70 millimeter lens. So I'm at 70 millimeters at f2.8. We don't get that big of a bokeh.
Why in the world would this cost more than double the price than another lens with the same aperture that's made for a larger sensor? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Now, I'm genuinely not going to criticize anybody who takes their own time to review kit. I know the work involved and I know how hard it is. I also know that these people are referring to field of view. And maybe that's what we should all do. When comparing lenses, maybe we need to say this lens has the same field of view as, say, a 24 to 70 on a 35mm or full frame sensor. We've got to get away from saying this lens is equivalent to, because they're not. They don't look the same, and they're not equivalent to, unless you include both sides of the equation. So if you're going to divide the focal length by the crop factor, you have to also divide the aperture by the crop factor, and that doesn't make lenses look so good. Maybe it should be the manufacturers who should be leading the way on this. Maybe it's me getting it wrong, and everyone knows that when we refer to a lens being equivalent to, we're only talking about the field of view and nothing else. But that's not how these lenses are sold to us. Wouldn't it be better if we called it field of view or FOV? If the little lens on my drone said 28mm FOV instead of EQV, I'd have nothing to rant about. So I'll get down off my high horse now and declare this rant over. Although I could talk about how you've got to divide the ISO by the square of the crop factor if you want the noise on different size sensors to match. Or we could talk about the relevance of circle of confusion when shooting 4K video. Or maybe how changing focal length doesn't directly change your depth of field. Maybe they should wait for another video.